Most of the greens you eat came shrink-wrapped off a shelf, washed, tracked, forgettable. Margaret picked hers wild, from the soft ground at the edge of a lake, the way she had for years. She did everything a careful person does. She cooked them. She got on with her life. About a year and a half later, a surgeon in Canberra opened her skull, reached into her brain with a pair of forceps, and pulled out something 8 centimeters long. It was red. It was moving. And in the entire history of medicine, it had never been found inside a human being before. Margaret was 64, and she was the one everyone in her family called when they couldn't remember something. A birthday? A phone number? The name of a second cousin they'd met once at a wedding. She kept all of it. She lived alone now, in the southeast corner of New South Wales, a few years a widow, a grandmother several times over. Her place sat in that quiet stretch of country where the bush comes right up to the back door. She still drove out to see the people she loved, and she remembered exactly how each of them took their tea. And she foraged, not as a hobby, more as something she had simply always done. Her own mother had shown her decades ago which leaves by the water were good to eat. One of them was Warrigal greens, a native trailing plant that people here have cooked like spinach for generations. It grows low and thick around water, and you can gather it by the handful at the edge of the lake near her home. To Margaret, it wasn't exotic. It was Tuesday. Here's the part nobody could have known. That same lake was home to carpet pythons, big, heavy, harmless-looking snakes that drape themselves over branches and bask on the banks. And inside those pythons lived a parasite, a roundworm called Ophidascaris robertsi. The snake is its entire world. The worm lays its eggs. The python sheds them in its droppings. The eggs scatter across the ground and the leaves, and then some small animal eats them, and the cycle starts again. The greens Margaret was gathering grew in that exact soil. Somewhere in there, on a leaf, on her fingers, on a knife she didn't think to scrub, were microscopic eggs that were never meant for a human body. She swallowed them. And she became something the parasite had no idea what to do with. An accident. A host it was never built for. She wouldn't feel a thing for weeks. It started in her stomach. In January of 2021, after about 3 weeks of abdominal pain and diarrhea, Margaret was admitted to hospital. Then it climbed. A dry cough, fevers, night sweats that soaked the sheets. Nothing that screamed parasite, just a body that wouldn't settle. The doctors did what good doctors do. They ran her blood, and one number jumped out. Her eosinophils were sky high. Eosinophils are a kind of white blood cell, and your body keeps them in reserve for one job in particular: fighting invaders too big for an ordinary immune cell to swallow, things with bodies, things like worms. When that count spikes, your own blood is practically shouting the answer. Hers was sitting near 10, many times higher than it should be. The alarm was ringing. Nobody could see what had set it off. Then they scanned her, and it got stranger. Her lungs were dotted with hazy patches. There were spots on her liver and spots on her spleen. And the patches in her lungs did something lesions are not supposed to do. They moved. A scan 1 week showed damage in one place. A scan a while later showed it somewhere else, fading here, blooming there. As if something were traveling through her, leaving a trail of wreckage and moving on before anyone could catch up. They were looking at a path. They just didn't know yet that it was a path. This is the cruel thing about a story like this. Her body was telling the truth the whole time. The high eosinophils, the wandering damage, the long, slow burn. All of it pointed at a living thing on the move. But no doctor on Earth had a reason to suspect a python's parasite was loose inside a woman in suburban Australia. So they kept hunting for an answer that made sense. They worked through the list, carefully and honestly. Was it a strange pneumonia? An eosinophilic pneumonia? The lungs inflamed for reasons unknown? Maybe. Was it cancer? They went looking. They washed out her lungs and checked, and they ruled it out. Eventually, the leading theory was autoimmune. A rare condition where the immune system, for no reason anyone can find, turns its own eosinophils loose on the body's tissue. On paper, it fit. The sky-high counts, the scattered organ damage, it fit well enough to act on. And the treatment for an immune system attacking itself is to shut that immune system down. So that's what they did. They put Margaret on a steroid to calm the inflammation, then a second drug to suppress it further, then a third, a specialized antibody designed to hunt down and switch off the exact cells that were running so high. Now read that again, knowing what we know. Her eosinophils were high because they were fighting a real invader, a living larva crawling through her organs, and the most advanced medicine in the room was carefully, deliberately turning those defenses off, one by one, because everyone believed the alarm was a false one. It was not a false alarm. It was the only thing in her body that understood what was happening. For a while on the drugs, she seemed steady. The lung spots calmed, her counts came down. It looked like progress. It was the worst kind of progress. The guard had been stood down, and the thing inside her was free to go wherever it wanted next. It went up. In 2022, Margaret changed. Not her body this time. Her mind. The woman who never forgot a name began to forget. Her daughter noticed it first. The repeated questions, the appointments that slipped. The long, searching pause where a grandchild's name used to be. Over about 3 months it got worse, and something heavier came with it. A flat, reasonless depression that settled over a woman who had never once been prone to it. From the outside it might have looked like age, like grief, like the toll of being sick and frightened for over a year with no name for what was wrong. It was none of those things. When they finally put her in an MRI scanner and looked at her brain, they found it. A lesion in the right frontal lobe, the part of the brain that sits behind your forehead and runs your focus, your mood, your memory. A spot about 13 millimeters across, lit up and undeniable. The woman who held her whole family's memory had something growing in the part of the brain where memory lives. Nobody at this point called it cancer. They genuinely did not know what it was. It could have been a tumor. It could have been an abscess. It was a 13-millimeter question mark sitting in the most delicate place she had, and there was only one way to get an answer. They were going to have to open her head and take a piece of it out. A neurosurgeon named Dr. Hari Priya Bandi would do the operation. She went in expecting tissue, a sample, something to put under a microscope and finally name. She did not go in expecting the sample to move. Before we step into that operating room, you need to understand what had actually been happening inside Margaret, because it is worse than a tumor. A tumor is your own cells gone wrong. This was a guest. Go back to those eggs on the greens. You swallow them. In your gut, they hatch. And out of each one comes a larva smaller than a grain of sand, blind, hungry, and lost. In a python, this is the right address. In you, it is a stranger in a country it cannot read. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It burrows out of the gut and starts to travel. This is a real medical phenomenon, and it has a name: visceral larva migrans. The larva migrating through your insides. Those wandering shadows in her lungs, the spots on her liver and her spleen, were never separate illnesses. That was the route. That was the worm looking for a way through. And this kind of parasite doesn't just survive the trip, it grows. In the small animals it is meant to infect, this larva can reach 7 or 8 centimeters. and in a laboratory, these larvae have been kept alive inside a host for more than 4 years. 4 years, patient, growing, in no hurry at all. The one inside Margaret kept climbing, up through her body, past every defense that had just been switched off in front of it, until it reached the one place a migrating worm is never supposed to reach. It crossed into her brain, and it kept going. June 2022, the operating theater in Canberra. Dr. Bandy opened the protective layers over Margaret's brain and looked at the lesion she had come to sample. Inside it was something that did not belong. A thin, string-like structure threaded into the tissue. She took hold of it, and she drew it out. It was a worm. 8 centimeters long, about as long as your finger and most of your palm. 1 millimeter thin. A deep, living red. And it was alive. Out in the open air, on the instrument, in front of a room full of people who do this for a living, it was still wriggling. Sit in that room for a second. These are surgeons and nurses who have seen the inside of the human body more times than they could count. And they are standing around a wriggling red worm that one of them has just pulled, alive, out of a living person's brain. There is no protocol for that moment. There is no chapter in any textbook, because in the entire recorded history of medicine, it had never happened to a human being. They didn't guess at what it was. They sent it to 2 universities. Geneticists at the University of Sydney and the University of Melbourne read its DNA and matched it more than 99% to Ophidascaris robertsi, a carpet python's parasite, a 3rd-stage larva pulled alive from a woman's brain. And they wrote the whole thing up in a journal run by the United States Centers for Disease Control, so the rest of the world would know it was possible. The thing on the greens by the lake had made it all the way to the inside of her skull. The infectious disease physician who had been chasing this case for over a year was Associate Professor Sanjaya Senanayake of the Australian National University. When it was finally over, he said it as plainly as it can be said. This is the first ever human case of Ophidascaris to be described in the world. And then the line that should put the hair up on your arms. To our knowledge, this is also the first case to involve the brain of any mammalian species, human or otherwise. Not the first in a human, the first in any mammal ever recorded, a frontier crossed inside an ordinary woman who had simply picked the wrong plant by the wrong lake. The doctors did not treat it as a freak, not a 1 in a billion fluke to be filed and forgotten. They treated it as a warning. Because Ophidascaris is not only an Australian problem. Related worms live inside snakes all over the world. The reason this had never happened before might not be that it can't happen. It might just be that until now, the path of a python's parasite and the path of a human life had never quite crossed. We are clearing more land, living closer to wildlife, foraging and building at the edges of the wild. Every one of those edges is a place where something meant only for an animal can find its way, by accident, into a person. This was not the last story like this. It was one of the first. There was still the problem of Margaret. One worm was out, but nobody could promise it was the only one. With a parasite never before seen in a person, there was no test that said all clear, no protocol that said you're safe now. There could be more larvae anywhere, quietly waiting. So they treated her with anti-parasitic drugs, albendazole and ivermectin, to kill anything that was left. And here they ran into one last danger, a real one. When you kill a parasite lodged near the brain, the dying worm sets off a wave of inflammation, and inflammation in the brain can do its own damage. The cure itself carried a risk, so they gave her a steroid alongside it, carefully, to hold that swelling down while the drugs did their work. They had to kill it gently. 6 months after the surgery, her blood work was back to normal. Her memory and her mood had improved. Not perfectly, not all the way, but improved. The family's memory keeper got some of herself back. After everything her body had been through, that is a quieter ending than the movies would give you. It is also the truth. So what do you take from this, beyond the obvious nightmare of it? Not, never eat your greens. Washing and properly cooking wild foraged plants matters, and it is worth doing. But the lesson runs deeper than the kitchen. If you forage, or you live close to wildlife, or you have spent time somewhere off the map, your exposures are part of your medical story. Most intake forms will never ask, so you have to tell them. If you ever develop symptoms that wander, that move from your gut to your lungs to somewhere new that nobody can pin down, say the words out loud to your doctor. Could this be a parasite? Here is where I have been. Here is what I have eaten. The clue that finally cracked Margaret's case had been sitting in her blood the whole time. The alarm was always ringing. It just needed one person to ask the question nobody else had thought to ask. And that's where we closed the file. This was Symptom 0. See you in the next one. Stay healthy.